So we are live now. Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone present in today's session. I, Pragnya Panda, welcome you to the Stories of Beliefs and Social Customs curated under the TMYS review, June 2022, in collaboration with Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. We are also calling for the submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Professor Danielle N. Boaz, Professor Mikel Burley, and Dr. Joanne Scurlock, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic of today's discussion is rituals, obsessions, compulsions, and self harm under the sub theme Festivities and Ritualistic Practices. All of them are experts in this area with many years of professional experience. So, before we start today's discussion, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for tonight is Professor Danielle N. Boaz, who is an Associate Professor of Africana Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Dr. Boaz is the author of Banning Black Gods, Law and Religions of the African Diaspora, which explores the global rise in religious racism in the 21st century. Her website, www.religiousracism.org/Brazil, tracks cases of intolerance against Afro-Brazilian religions. Dr. Boaz is also co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Africana Religions. We welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. So for my opening remarks, and
Ma'am,
are you going to introduce everyone? I apologize. And then
yes,
I'll go. Okay.
that's fine. Our second speaker for tonight is Professor Mikel Burley, who is an associate professor of religion and philosophy at the University of Leeds, UK. His recent publications include A Radical Pluralist Philosophy of Religion, Cross-Cultural, Multi-Religious, Interdisciplinary, Bloomsbury 2020, and Dance of the Deodhas, Divine Possession, Blood Sacrifice, and the Grotesque Body in Assamese Goddess Worship, Religions of South Asia. We welcome you, sir. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Our third speaker for tonight is Dr. Joanne Scurlock, a native of Kansas City who received her BA and PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations of the University of Chicago. She has authored 3 books, Magico-Medical Means of Treating Ghost-Induced Illnesses in Ancient Mesopotamia, Leiden 2006, Diagnosis in Assyrian and Babylonian Medicine, Champaign 2005, and Sourcebook for Ancient Mesopotamian Medicine, Atlanta 2014. She has written extensively on Mesopotamian magic, medicine, death customs, the military, and other aspects of cultural history. She taught in the history department of Elmhurst College. We welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us this evening. So now we open the forum for discussion. I would like to request Professor Boaz to begin. Ma'am, over to you now.
Okay. Thank you. And again, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation to join this, what's sure to be a fascinating discussion. So as you all heard a moment ago, my background is in law and legal history. So for my opening remarks, rather than focusing on the actual study of rituals and festivals, my area of expertise is about discrimination and intolerance against religions and their rites and practices. I focus on religions of the African diaspora. So we're talking about religions popularly known as Santeria, often discussed as leukemia or described as leukemia among devotees. Religions like Candomblé, Haitian Vodou, New Orleans Voodoo, Obia, and Palo Mayombe. So for my opening remarks, I wanted to talk about 5 or 6 main things that these religions do in their ceremonies that have often been classified as superstitions or barbaric practices, things that often are discriminated against by outsiders, and things that historically, dating back to at least the 19th century and in some cases much earlier, the aspects of these religions that that governments have targeted and attempted to eradicate practices from these religions or to use these as a basis to prohibit religions altogether. So the first thing that I would mention of these practices that have been targeted in African diaspora rituals and festivals is drumming. Music is very important in religions of the African diaspora. And drumming in particular has often been treated as something that's barbaric, something that needs to be restricted or prohibited. Such prohibitions date back to slavery and often started to prevent enslaved people from
Right.
gathering or engaging in ceremonies that might be used as a covert method to plan a slave rebellion. And drums, because of the way that they're played, they often offered coded means of communication that plantation owners couldn't understand.
Yeah.
So historically, this is why drums began to be seen as something that was particularly dangerous, something that needed to be prohibited in African diaspora religions. But today, it continues to be something that's characterized as a very sort of savage or primitive type of music. And when used in ceremonies, whether we're talking about ceremonies that sometimes occur in someone's home or even in an official temple, people often call the police to complain, and then it's astonishing the way that the authorities frequently respond. And I'm speaking in general about countries throughout the Americas in particular. Police officers will often show up to a noise complaint with what's basically a small army, cars full of police officers, sometimes with guns drawn or other weapons out, as if they're anticipating invading some kind of dangerous criminal compound. The second thing that has been a subject of a lot of laws and a point of discrimination against African diaspora religions is the use of physical objects, physical matter in rituals and prayers. So historically, hundreds of years ago, this would have been typically the use of various kinds of charms, bundles of sacred materials that were a way to make a ritual more effective.
Yeah.
In some places, using any kind of physical object in religious worship was prohibited. So there were laws in the Americas that actually said that the possession of any implements or instruments of these religious practices was against the law. Another aspect of using physical matter in religious worship that has often been targeted is the use of plants, herbs, natural materials.
Oh, great.
That has typically been something that has been viewed with suspicion and prohibited through limitations on herbal medicine or folk healing. And then today, another aspect of this is the placement of things like offerings like flowers or candles or alcohol in public spaces. And the reason that this is often a big controversy today, or that people overtly say that they object to public offerings today, is an idea of pollution, that these offerings damage public spaces, pollute the environment. But I argue that this is something that's really ironic and contradictory, because African diaspora religions often have a very close relationship with nature. Priests often grow their own plants, and a lot of rituals incorporate nature. So there's really a strong incentive not to pollute nature. The third thing that is often a source of discrimination and laws and policies banning these religions is divination. And divination can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different religions. In African diaspora religions, it's often a pretty formalized practice, something that priests spend years and years training how to do. And it's frequently a process of communicating with spirits or some kind of gods, divinities, using things like shells, nuts, seeds, or bones. And unlike what we typically see on TV, divination doesn't necessarily mean something like predicting the future. In these religions, it's more about seeing the bigger picture of what's going on in life, what kind of a journey a person's on, how their past informs the present, and what steps a person can take in the present to create the best possible future, or to create the best, cultivate the best kind of situation in their present life. But divination has often been treated like a trick, like a form of fraud, and devotees of these religions have often been prosecuted for it. So the fourth thing that I'll mention today is actually really closely related to divination, and that is communication with ancestors or other spirits of the dead. African diaspora religions often center on the idea that the world of the living and the world of the dead are not these drastically different places, are not these distinct separate spheres. They center on the idea that we should still honor and communicate with people who have passed on to the ancestral world. And historically, especially in the Atlantic world, in certain parts of Europe, in the Americas, we have seen many, many laws, centuries of laws prohibiting or restricting the act of spirit conjuring or communicating with the dead. And today, even though a lot of those laws, for the most part, those laws have been removed, we still see there are certain biases against this practice, and sometimes there are cases where people are prosecuted for fraud when they're engaging in these kinds of communications. There are also certain policies about where and how people are buried, what kind of ceremonies can happen in cemeteries, and just a tendency to interrupt ceremonies that happen in cemeteries or somehow involve communication with departed persons. And so we still see a lot of bias against this, although it's a little less formalized, a little less legally formalized than it was years ago. And then the last thing that I'll mention, and I'll just mention this very quickly, is probably the most common method of persecuting African diaspora religions, which is targeting the practice of the ritual slaughter of animals or animal sacrifice. This is a central practice to many, but not necessarily all, African diaspora religions, and it's one that has been prohibited by law, or that authorities have attempted to prohibit by law in many, many different countries, especially in the past few years. And I think I'll just close my remarks with that today and say that I just mentioned that these are some distinct practices or aspects of ceremonies and festivals in African diaspora religions that are maybe a little bit different from the mainstream and end up being targeted by authorities and by non-practitioners as a source of discrimination.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your valuable insights. I would now request Professor Burley to share his views and perspectives with us. Over to you, sir. Sir, you're on mute. Could you please unmute?
Yes, I was just asking if you could unmute me, but I think, well, I'm unmuted now, so that's fine. Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion. It's a pleasure to be here. My own research falls broadly within the field of philosophy of religion. And under that heading, I have a strong interest in expanding the range of subject matter that can be engaged with philosophically. One way of expanding the scope of philosophy of religion is to draw upon resources from neighbouring disciplines such as anthropology and other empirical approaches to the study of religion and culture. Among the areas of my research that are most relevant to our topics today is a study that I carried out in 2017 into a particular religious festival at the Karmakya temple near Guwahati in the northeastern Indian state of Assam. The festival in question is Manasa Puja, the ritual or puja of the snake goddess Manasa. And at the Karmakya temple, it is celebrated roughly in the middle of August in a prolonged 3-day ritual known as Diyadhani Nach or Diyadhani Utsav, literally the dance or festival of the Deodars. The literal meaning of the term Deodar is often said to be something like voice or echo of the gods. In the context of the Deodhani festival, it refers to male dancers of whom it's claimed that they are possessed by deities, including several of the most ferocious goddesses of the Hindu pantheon. The Deodhani festival incorporates animal sacrifice, which is a regular occurrence at the Karmakya temple. The main sacrificial animals are pigeons and young male goats. At certain times during the festival, the Deodars, in keeping with the fierce personas of the deities that they are said to embody, ritually drink the blood of the sacrificed animals. A myth of origin of the Dayadani festival declares that there was once a great king, Maharaja, who yearned to have a son. Praying to the goddess Bhairavi, the king promised to give his own head to her as an oblation if a son would be granted to him. Approving of this pledge, Bhairavi fulfilled the king's request. But in his delight at receiving a son, the king apparently forgot to discharge his side of the bargain until Bhairavi reminded him of it in a vision. In response, according to the myth, the king decapitated himself with a golden knife, offering the head to Bhairavi. By this act, the king attained a divine status and subsequently took possession of the body of a young male devotee, thereby beginning the Dayadani tradition. Curiously, the myth of origin makes no explicit reference to the goddess Manasa, but there are affinities between Manasa and Bhairavi. Each of them is among the goddesses who have both destructive and benevolent aspects to their character. They are traditionally regarded as sources both of violence and of healing and regeneration. The theme of self-harm, which is one of our themes today, is not a prominent theme in the Dayadani festival, but the ritual dance performed by the Dayadas is undoubtedly grueling and taxing upon their physical bodies. There's vigorous drumming, both within the temple and in the courtyard outside, combined with the clashing of cymbals and the blaring of small bugles. The Dayadas dance and run and jump, carrying weapons such as swords, tridents, and sticks. Stamping their feet and shouting, they move rhythmically for hours on end in hot and humid conditions. Their skin is daubed with red vermilion paste and animal blood, and as the festival proceeds, they accumulate numerous garlands of flowers placed around their necks by members of the crowd. A key moment in the performance comes when two of the Dayadas hold two swords alongside each other, parallel to the floor, at about thigh height, with the sharp edge of the swords turned upwards. Other Dayadas then take it in turns to stand on the sword blades. So here again, we have not so much the theme of self-harm, but certainly a theme of placing extreme demands upon the physical body. As the Dayada balances upon the sword blades, the atmosphere in the temple complex intensifies. A section of the watching crowd closes in around the Dayadas, and spectators on the stone steps besides the courtyard rise to their feet. As the drums continue to pound and the cymbals clash, the crowd whoop and cheer. Many of the women in the crowd ululate, issuing a shrill cry while moving the tongue rapidly from side to side. Something like this. I'm not very good at it, but something like this. And live pigeons are then raised in the air by temple assistants or other members of the crowd and are handed to the Dayada, who is mounted on the swords. Seizing a pigeon in his hand, or in some instances taking its head directly into his mouth, the Dayada clamps his teeth down on the bird's neck and tugs its body away from him, thereby snapping off its head. Some of the Dayadas do this to 2 or 3 or 4 pigeons, each time throwing the headless body into the crowd. At this point in the festival, the mutual engagement between the ritual performers and the spectating crowd is at its peak. The incessant throbbing of the percussive instruments instigates the charged atmosphere, but the atmosphere is thickened by the anticipatory eagerness of the onlookers. The response of the crowd plays a significant role in constituting the ritual itself. Thinking about the ritual in relation to Hindu traditions more broadly, we can view it as part of the complex panoply of practices and forms of religiosity known as Tantra, or in this case, Shakta Tantra or Goddess Tantra in particular. Assam is often described as an important location of Tantric traditions, in which the power of desire and passion is utilized for both worldly and spiritual purposes. The emphasis on desire is integral to a more encompassing orientation, which seeks to overcome dualistic categories by deliberately subverting or inverting orthodox Brahmanical religious and social norms. The motif of inversion is vividly present in the Tantric rituals that contravene Brahmanical conventions concerning purity and impurity. Tantric animal sacrifice, for example, is not only at variance with widespread Hindu opposition to the slaughter of animals in general, but normally deploys a method of killing, namely decapitation, that emphatically violates the ancient Vedic requirement to suffocate sacrificial animals to avoid the shedding of blood, for blood was considered an impure substance. In certain forms of tantric practice, then, the production and consumption of supposedly impure substances is a means of demonstrating and overcoming precisely the dichotomy between the pure and the impure. As the 11th century Kashmiri tantric philosopher Abhinavagupta put it, such ritual activities, quote, dissolve the impurity that is plurality. In other words, by freeing oneself from the state of mind that feels doubt or inhibition in the face of such activities, quote, one throws off the contamination imposed by the restrictions, that is, the restrictions of normal social or ethical regulations. In the case of the Deodani festival, the transgression of social norms takes place in conjunction with the performance of divine possession. The Deodars embody the transgressive power of the gods and goddesses, who are, we might say, beyond good and evil, beyond ordinary conceptions of purity and impurity. Needless to say, however, such rituals involving divine possession, animal sacrifice, and the ingestion of blood are ethically and religiously controversial. Throughout India and in Assam itself, there are religious and animal welfare groups who are vehemently opposed to the kinds of practices that constitute the Deodani festival. I should mention that many different religious and moral outlooks exist alongside one another in modern-day Assam. During the week leading up to the Deodani festival that I attended, for example, a local branch of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness was celebrating the birthday of Lord Krishna in a large marquee less than a mile from the Karmakya temple. Members of that society are strict vegetarians, most of whom are strongly opposed to animal sacrifice. Without directly protesting against the events at the Karmakya temple, these devotees of Krishna exemplified a contrasting presence. In what we might call the raucous and colourful patchwork of religious perspectives that we find across India and including in Assam. And I think I'll end my presentation there. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, sir, for your knowledge, and that was indeed fascinating. I would now request Dr. Scurlock to take over from here. Over to you, ma'am. Ma'am, you're on mute. Yes, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, very good. I thought I had it unmuted already. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm really thrilled to meet these lovely people and to be able to talk to you all. My expertise is ancient Mesopotamia, and I deal in a society and a system where beliefs and practices of the sort you are describing were not sanctioned at all. In fact, they were the norm for people rather than the aberration. So I can give you some idea of how these things looked in their, shall we say, original setting. The gods of ancient Mesopotamia, and they were plural gods, were immanent. And that meant that not only did they have play in the normal world, this veil of tears, as we call it, but they were useful for helping you with the problems that emerge from this world. And they were approachable, and they were amenable to being influenced. No one had the illusion that you could control supernatural forces. What you could do was to palliate their anger when they got angry, and that could be a serious problem, or to influence them in some way that persuaded them to help you with what you needed. And in order to maintain the relationship that allowed this to happen, and it wasn't optional, by the way, you did not have to maintain a relationship with a god. There was no obligation, any particular god. You could stop doing it. In fact, you had to renew that relationship every year. And what you would do is there were a group of priests who were set aside. There was a house that was built for the god, and the priests would feed him and clothe him and provide him with parties and whatever else in order to make him available for private people with their private problems to approach him directly. I mean, the community itself, of course, could do it as a group, but individuals were expected to come to the gods for help. And you would go and you would pray and you make a little offering, and then you might make a vow or some sort if there was a resolution to your problem. And then if you got it, you gave a gift. And if you didn't get it, you didn't give anything. So this was sort of the relationship here. The man was in the driver's seat, really, in this religion, and not the gods. And it was for use, not for show. Let's put it that way. So how did magic fit into all this? Okay, so you have the priests doing their thing and people going and privately solving their problems with the gods. But there are certain types of problems that emerge in human life that are really beyond a person's ability to maintain some kind of balance with. And the things like, okay, you're going off to war. Who knows if you're going to be killed or not? You are engaged in business, and for some reason, it just seems to be going under, and you have no idea why. You're having trouble getting along with other people. You're quarreling with your wife all the time. You just seem to be in a bad mood continually. And most importantly, you're getting sick. And you're getting sick with something that is not going away and that you can't treat with whatever you know to do. And there you need professional help. And that professional help was provided in Mesopotamia by a gentleman called the Ashipu. And we think of him as an exorcist, but he was also a physician. So these people had great plant knowledge. There was actually an expert who dealt with the plants as such and who kept track of all of them and figured out how to grow them and all the rest of it. But cooperating with him, this doctor exorcist was able to use the plant medicines which they had to treat a wide variety of diseases. And they knew what they were doing, and the plants work. So, for example, turmeric, which is one of the plants they were using, is actually clinical for depression. So, and I mean in modern terms. So anyway, they used these effective medicines, but they, unlike us, they didn't say, okay, there's physical ailments and you get medicine for that, and there's mental ailments and you get therapy for that. They used what amounted to therapy for both the medicine and the mental problem of the worries and the stress that come with illness or even cause illness. So they had a couple of techniques in terms of the magic time, taking back just, okay, there's lots of pretty pictures and lovely things I could tell you about, but let me sort of focus in on what they're doing and how this is working as magic. So you have, let's say somebody has stress angina. And what the Mesopotamians did was they created a meta-narrative of what was causing the problem so that you could then deal with it. They used that to get the right plants to the right medicine, so it worked that way. But it also worked in terms of recommending certain types of strategies or approaches to the patient and his sort of mental well-being. And for angry gods, which is what stress angina produced, they sent you off to the god who was causing the problem to basically put yourself at his feet. These were typically personal gods, or Marduk, who behaves like a personal god. They were gods with whom you had more than a sort of a societal relationship. You had a personal relationship with these gods. And so they were angry at you for some reason known only to them. And you would go to them and you would pour out all your troubles, let out all that stress and anxiety in their listening, sympathetic ear. Okay, so that was for that. There were other rituals that were had a cathartic. You suspect that people are out to get you. You know people are out to get you because you found some witchcraft on your front door. So you are stressed in that sense. what we do for that, and there's certain illnesses that were believed to be related to witchcraft. Okay, so what do you do for witchcraft? So what you do is you take out your fear and apprehension that the witchcraft is going to kill you by taking a group of figurines and sticking pins in them and burning them and roasting them and otherwise tying their hands behind their backs and whatever. You basically take all that energy, aggressive energy, out on them. However, and this is a very important part of this, that you do not ever make it personal. You do not attack a specific person, even if you have 99% certainty as to who it was who did whatever it was, and what you think they did. You are encouraged to make two figurines. One is a man and one is a woman. So you're not being specific as to the sex of the person. And the name you write on them, and you do have to label them because it's a personification of your problem, that you write on them the name which says as follows: the witch or sorceress or whatever who afflicted so-and-so. And then you put your own name on that. So it's the one who's getting you, not witches in general, but witchcraft in general, but the specific person that's causing you your trouble. Okay, you write that on there. And then you present them to the god of justice, as the sun god, and you are encouraged to pray. And what you pray for essentially is for the god to do you justice. You can also let out some of your problems too while you're at it. You can say, there's a section in this ritual where you're allowed to speak for yourself and to say what, how badly you've been made to feel, and sort of try to engage sympathy, or just let it out. And the court of justice in the heavens will decide the case, and they will go and get whoever it was who was causing you trouble, if anybody, and do something about it. And in the meantime, you're done. And the only thing you might want to do is to wear some kind of an amulet. And there are amulets that you can do. That's preventive medicine, basically. You're trying to prevent the illness, whatever the cause of it was, from coming back to get you again. And some of the amulets that you wear have actual medicines in them. In other words, the medicine that would be used to treat your, say, epilepsy are in the amulet you use against it. So if you start to have a seizure, you can just break the thing open, and essentially you've got a supply of it handy. It's like carrying an aspirin bottle around in a rope around your neck. And so that's sort of what I call the catharsis. And then there is dissociation, which is very important technique for dealing with ghosts, or there are a number of demons who are ghosts by position. They're people who died unhappy lives or died way before their time. And these are, again, this is a meta-narrative to the types of illnesses that these people cause. A meta-narrative that allows you to engage in the illness, allows you to talk to it, to be part of your cure, but also to show some sympathy. Ghosts are once human beings. They're not completely disconnected from the human world. And so there's a certain amount of sympathy that's shown for them. And the rituals that get rid of, let's say, the Lulu demon, which is one of these class of people. They're young people, the meta-narrative, who died before their time. They were never able to have children. They were never able to know that, and it's both men and women, have the joy of having children and being married and having sex and all that good stuff. So anyway, their problem is that they want all those things, and they're coming to get them, and they pick on people, and they say, oh, I'm a handsome prince. I'm full of wealth. You'll be dressed in silks and satins, and you'll have gold rings on your fingers. Just marry me. Well, if you do, you're done. And you become another one of these categories. So they break the chain in the meta-narrative by providing the Lulu demon with a substitute for the patient, another little figurine that will represent their new wife, and they get all kinds of presents, like a dowry for the woman, and they marry them to each other, the two figurines, and then they take them out, put them someplace out in the steppe region, which is connected to the netherworld, where they can live happily ever after as a married couple. So anyway, that's all I have to say for the moment. And thank you again for asking me.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that very interesting and informative presentation. We now move to the question and answer section. I would like to begin with Professor Boaz. So, ma'am, my first question to you is, a lot of governments across nations have banned the practice of animal sacrifice, claiming it to be primitive, superstitious, and causing a threat to the well being of society. However, do you agree that this is a way of curbing religious freedom and suppressing minorities?
Thank you. That's a really great question. And my answer would be absolutely. This is something that has been going on, especially I would say in the past 5 to 10 years, all over the world, in Europe, Asia, the Americas. And when we look at places that have passed laws about religious communities slaughtering animals, whether it's for food consumption or for some kind of ritual practices or some combination of the two, these laws are always part of a bigger pattern of discrimination against religious communities, without exception, without question. And the easiest example that I can give of this is one that's connected to my own research, which is the recent controversies about animal sacrifice in Brazil among Afro-Brazilian religious communities. So the Supreme Court of Brazil just heard a case about this in 2019. And it was stemming from a debate that happened for about 15 years or so, where legislators in one of the states in the south of the country were going back and forth about whether animal sacrifice could or should be prohibited. And in the same 15 years that folks are trying to prohibit animal sacrifice, there are widespread attacks on Afro-Brazilian religions throughout the country. So devotees are being prohibited from using public transportation or even taking a ride share if they're dressed in their religious attire, or if their destination, in the case of a ride share, if their known destination is an Afro-Brazilian temple. In frequent occurrences, and we're talking about sometimes hundreds and hundreds of cases per year, temples are being invaded, people are destroying sacred objects, burning temples down. Sometimes in certain locales, we're talking like the federal district in particular, this was a problem back in 2015 or 2016. There were over a dozen temples, Afro-Brazilian temples, burned in less than 6 months. In certain cities or areas, priests are being mysteriously murdered, and they're not really, the police aren't really investigating them, or if they are investigating the cases, they're saying, oh, this is just an unconnected series of murders that are about neighborhood disputes or something, and they're overlooking the fact that perhaps 5 or 6 or 7 priests are being murdered, sometimes in their temples and in their religious attire with no apparent motive in a matter of months or so. And in one particularly famous case, this made international headlines. Some folks listening may have even heard about this. In the state of Rio back in 2015, some people were launching stones at this Candomblé family as they were walking down the street, either leaving or going to a ceremony. I can't recall at the moment. And the people throwing the stones, they hit an 11-year-old girl in the head and knocked her unconscious, sent her to the hospital. And so these are the kinds of things that are happening throughout the country that are kind of the other prongs that we don't always think about animal sacrifice laws or prohibitions being a part of this, but really all these things are deeply connected. They're multifaceted, multi-front attacks on religious practice, on devotees, and multiple ways of expressing discrimination.
That was indeed heartbreaking to hear, but thank you for your views, ma'am. My second question to you is that you have authored a paper on Obeah rituals, which refer to a variety of African-derived spiritual practices. Can you share some information about the Obeah rituals that were practiced in the Caribbean regions and what led to the prohibition of these rituals?
Sure. So Obeah is a word that comes from the former British Caribbean. So we're talking about places like Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad. And basically, it was a catch-all term that the British used to refer to African spiritual practices in their territories, in their colonies. And if you think about how many different African ethnic groups were trafficked in the Atlantic slave trade and how many different religions would have been practiced among them, then you quickly realize how broad this term really was. But where we really get kind of some kind of solidifying of what the term is or what it might mean comes from the law. And obeah has been prohibited in the British Caribbean since 1760. And the laws against it have always been extremely broad. They've never attempted to define obeah, but occasionally they'll describe it. And usually these descriptions will say something like it's synonymous with pretending to practice witchcraft or pretending to have supernatural powers. And the latter of these terms is obviously really complicated because virtually every religion pretends to have supernatural powers, right? So obeah was first prohibited for the same reason that almost every colony in the Americas had some kind of restriction on Africana religions, which is that priests led and assisted with slave rebellions. They organized rebellions, they provided charms and rituals to protect people, that kind of thing. But over time after emancipation, obeah and other African diaspora religions were prohibited as types of superstitions. And getting rid of African diaspora religions was supposed to help civilize Black people and prepare them for freedom, prepare them for participation in a free society. So historically, the kinds of things that were prosecuted as obeah were things like the use of charms, working with spirits, and divination, as well as just a variety of rituals that were designed to bring someone luck or love, or help them with things like employment, or help them with their business. And I think it's important to kind of end on the fact that obeah laws still exist in a number of different Caribbean countries. I think it's still over a dozen. They are rarely enforced today, but when they are, they're usually conducted kind of like fraud prosecutions, where authorities hear about somebody performing some kind of ritual, charging money for it. Usually it's something to do with communication with spirits or divination. And so the authorities charge them with fraud or with obeah for accepting money for spiritual practices. So as you can see, it's a really hard definition to pin down, but I think this was pretty intentional so that over the years, the government, the police could target whatever they wanted to or felt they needed to suppress in the moment.
Thank you for sharing all that valuable information with us, ma'am. I would now like to ask my question to Professor Burley. So, sir, my first question to you is, the doctrine of karma has been praised as a rational and moral explanation for the existence of evil and apparent injustice in the world. However, some say that it is a misguided dogma that distorts one's visions of reality and often leads to violent and obsessive rituals. Can you share your views on this?
Yes, yes, certainly. I mean, I don't know, I can't immediately think of any good evidence to show that it's often the case that a belief in the doctrine of karma leads to violence or obsessive rituals. But there are certainly some sort of prevalent things about the doctrine of karma that many people find objectionable. And sort of prominent among those is the idea that even the most sort of marginalized and disadvantaged people in society are in some sense responsible for their own predicament because of some sort of morally relevant action that they did either earlier in this life or in some previous life. And many people, well, non-believers in the doctrine of karma may well see that as a kind of blaming of the victim. It's sort of holding people responsible for their own misfortunes or disadvantages. Now, a possible response that has been sort of put forward to that objection from so a response that's come from people who do believe in the doctrine of karma is that it's sometimes said that even if one regards someone as, in some sense, responsible for their own predicament, it doesn't preclude one expressing compassion and acting in a benevolent manner towards that person. But something I considered, I mean, I wasn't necessarily endorsing it, but I was considering it as a sort of possible view in something that I wrote, was that, you know, even just perceiving somebody as responsible for their own condition is not a morally neutral attitude to hold. You know, it's very different from perceiving somebody as a sort of innocent victim of circumstances, for example. So so there could still be room for a sort of moral objection to that aspect of the doctrine of karma. But then, before finishing my answer to this, I just want to add that in my experience, most believers in karma, the doctrine of karma, don't think that absolutely everything that happens to us is a result, a consequence of something that we did, we as individuals did in some previous life or even earlier in this life. But there is a sort of there's a range, there's a selection, there's a number of different sort of causal factors that play a part in one's existence. So so the idea that so the doctrine of karma leads to complete sort of conservative quietism or a kind of dismissive attitude of those who are in need of help, it would be mistaken. So it's, you know, as ever, it's a complex doctrine, but certainly some people have objections to it. Yeah.
Thank you for your perspective, sir. So my next question to you is, cannibalism is a practice that is assumed to be morally scandalous, and most people think that it probably never happens, at least in a culturally sanctioned form. However, you have authored an article that explores how cannibalism can have an intelligible place in human society. So can you give us some perspective behind this thought?
Yes, I can. I mean, it's right to say that cannibalism is rarely practiced these days. I don't think there's much evidence to show that it's very prevalent in societies around the world now, but it certainly has been in the past, and there is fairly reliable anthropological and historical evidence to indicate this. And it seems to have been practiced in a number of societies, small-scale societies around the world, up to about the 1960s in various places. Somewhere that I've been interested in, I haven't studied it directly myself, but through sort of the work of other anthropologists, is some of the small-scale societies in the Brazilian Amazon. And one of those societies is called the Wari. And it seems that they practiced a form of cannibalism up to the 1960s. But we should distinguish between, and this is something I've been interested in, sort of distinguishing between different forms of cannibalism and not thinking they're all of the same type. Two of the main sort of categories would be what we could call, on the one hand, warfare cannibalism, and another type is often called mortuary cannibalism or funerary cannibalism. So I'll just briefly sort of distinguish between these two types. Warfare cannibalism is it sort of involves when you've got a conflict between different societies, and a number of members of one society are killed by the opposing society, and the bodies of those victims are they've not only been killed, but they're then either in part or in whole consumed by the victors as an act of it could have various symbolic forms, but it's a sort of continuation of the act of violence and sort of humiliation of the victims quite commonly. And then the other type of cannibalism, sort of one of these two main types, mortuary or funerary cannibalism, is very different. It's the sort of cannibalism, the consuming of human flesh, that would occur within a society as part of the sort of funeral ritual, the funeral practice. So if somebody has died of whatever cause, then it would be a way of disposing of that body for people within the society to consume, again, in part or in whole. the body of the person who has died, and this would typically be seen as an act of respect and compassion, not only to the deceased person, him or herself, but also to the sort of close relatives of that person. And as it happens, the society in the Amazon that I mentioned, the Wari, carried out both these forms of cannibalism, but it was the mortuary form of cannibalism that was most prevalent more recently, sort of, as I say, up to the 1960s, and both these forms have taken place elsewhere. So I mean, so I think we need to bear in mind that cannibalism comes in very many varieties. They might have different, I suppose, different moral implications depending on which form we're talking about. And I won't, this is probably not time for me to go into it now, but one of the things I'm interested in is how this practice changes the attitude of the people towards other human beings, and perhaps has an influence upon their very conception of what it is to be human, which is obviously a very big subject, big area.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that very informative answer.
You're welcome.
I would now like to ask my question to Dr. Scurlock. So, ma'am, my first question to you is, in your book, Magico-Medical Means of Treating Ghost-Induced Illness in Ancient Mesopotamia, you have written about prescriptions designed to cure psychological and physical ailments thought to be caused by ghosts because of sins committed by humans. Can you share some of your knowledge on this concept?
Am I muted? Okay, fine. Essentially, the ghosts who, right, all right. So there are different levels of diagnosis involved in these things, which I've tried to make clear. There are diseases which they knew they couldn't handle, and there are diseases which they can. The ones that say the double of a dead person seized you were probably not treatable diseases. In other words, you've got somebody who's really seriously in about for vengeance, and you can't. There's really nothing they can do for the person. But the idea of sin is a difficult concept actually to transpose into a Mesopotamian. They have sort of words for it, but it doesn't have the same kind of overarching salvation, right? Being damned to hell if you do it, kind of connotations that they're misdeeds, basically. They're misdeeds against fellow human beings, and they're misdeeds against gods. And those will be punished one way or the other. But once your punishment is over, then it's a cleansing, essentially, of when you regard this whole idea of misdeeds, etc., is you make compensation and then you're done with it. Even you have this in the biblical text. You even have this idea. You have the sins against fellow man, you have sins against God, but both of them can be resolved by some sort of compensation and making it up to people. The sins against man, you make it up to the person and then you make an offering to God. And then you can make an offer if you've offended God in some way that does not produce a death penalty, and some of them are, then you simply make it up by saying you're sorry, promising never to do it again, and then offering it. So in other words, we know these things from penances and so forth. So it's similar, but as I said, it's not quite so cosmically oriented as our own version of this same trying to deal with the problem of guilt. Is essentially what you're talking about here.
Thank you for your answer, ma'am. That was indeed informative. My second question to you is that witchcraft, exorcism, and sorcery manifest in acts and rituals, texts and spells, and especially objects such as amulets and talismans, as you mentioned before. We observe that human beings often exhibit an unhealthy attachment and obsession with these objects. Why do you think that happens?
Okay, I'm questioning the question, because obsession is in the eye of the observer. In other words, the person looking at the system says, okay, this is obsessive behavior, and diagnoses it, as such, and then you try to treat it or whatever. But you have to be careful that when you're going cross-culture and when you're looking at another person's culture from the outside, things that look obsessive to you might not be considered obsessive, wrong, superstitious. Well, these are various words we've been coming up with, might not seem that way at all to them. So, and the specific example of the talismans, wearing them around every day on your neck is not an obsession. That's simply part of your treatment. It's intended to keep away. It's not intended to worry. It's intended to keep anything bad from happening to you. It's like a charm bracelet. It's like doing puja in the morning. You do these things to just keep things on an even keel and to make sure that nothing bad happens. That insofar as you can. I mean, you can't control these things. You're just doing a little bit of something or other to try to influence the karma forces or whatever around you to make sure that nothing bad happens today, at least, please. Okay, to you. They said that's not an obsession. There are obsessory, I think, okay, but anyway, I've said enough on that. Okay, yes. Next question.
All right, ma'am. Thank you for your answer. So with that, we come to an end to tonight's discussion. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Excuse me. I should have gone on, but I didn't. Do we have time? Do we have a few more minutes time?
Ma'am, would you like to share some more? Share something more? Yes, of course, you may. We do have time. Yes.
That when you look inside the culture, to look, there is a category of people who are obsessive. In other words, that there are people who obsess on some of these things. And since we have an actual example of somebody who did and was perceived by his own culture as being obsessive, it was the Assyrian king Esarhaddon. And his diviners and his doctors and these people around him told him, hey, look, don't worry. We've done everything we can. This is not going to happen. There's nothing's going to happen. And my favorite was, the God who created the earthquake created the apotropaic ritual to get rid of the earthquake. So, and he wasn't listening very, very loudly, but we know what his problems were. One is that he had something terribly wrong with him. We think it was lupus, which is a very mysterious disease. They wouldn't have been able to treat it, and it just produces symptoms all over the place. It's really hard even to diagnose. And so, they kept telling him nothing was wrong. And of course, he knew there was something that was wrong. Also, he had some family problems, meaning his grandfather was killed in battle and his father was assassinated. And two of his brothers were blamed for the assassination, rightly or wrongly, and driven out of the country. So he had serious worries about being assassinated at any moment. And he was a very fond father. He loved his children. And every time they got slightly sick, there was a major crisis. Teething was cosmic for him. And so he was in constant need of reassurance and so forth. And so you could say he was obsessing on the rituals that they were, but it was because he had very private, personal needs that were being fulfilled by these rituals. It was sort of a therapy for himself for the problems that he was having. So anyway, I think that's my best answer I can give on that. So the obsession question. So I thought we were out of time. Sorry.
No, ma'am, that's all right. Thank you so much for your valuable inputs. All right, then, with that, we come to an end to tonight's discussion. Thank you to each one of you for sharing your knowledge and valuable insights with us. I'm sure that our live audience that is watching this on Facebook had a wonderful time as well. I thank you all for taking out time from your extremely busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion organized on the TMYS platform. It was an absolute pleasure to have been in your company this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.